Welcome to Bible study for Wednesday mornings. I apologize, I had to move it by an hour as I spent a good deal of time this morning clearing out from the massive snowstorm from yesterday. So anyway, I'm here now. I was able to get all the salt off of me and my muscles won't be aching until later on tonight. But I'm glad to be here with you. I'm glad if you're able to join in live. Hello. And if you're watching later, I hope that this time will be helpful to you. This is the third study in the book of Psalms, and so of course we're doing one psalm every class, and so we're looking at Psalm 3. This psalm is titled A Psalm of David when he fled his son Absalom. I want to start with, as I usually do, with some contextual comments. Last time we met, we talked about these psalms, especially the one from last week was a psalm of the reflection of the king. And I want to say a little bit again about the context of the book of Psalms and their attributions, whether they were written during this time or not. It's important to get a different situation of life as a sample to remember that these psalms pretty much come from or reflect on a theology of a time when it was believed that God was present to God's people in the person of a king. We don't carry that official theology anymore. And last week I spent a lot of time trying to show how, and disturbing it may be, but to show that there is a developmental theology that goes on in the history of these people. After the Exodus and after the settlement of the land, each person was in their own inherited territory, and they were living the peaceable life, trying to carry out the law of God, which was the law of living selflessly and living for others, being a blessing to the families of the earth, as God put it in the conversation with Abram and Sarah at the very beginning. And there they were living out their life, and God was with them. Now, here's what I want to say. God was their ruler. God was their ruler. The terms of their life, the terms of life was that God is invisible, untouchable, but present, and you should follow God and God's law as if God is right there with you. There was the light that shone during the day, and the Shekinah of God, the presence of God. There was the pillar of fire, or of smoke during the day, and the fire by night. So there were signs of the presence of God. There was the Ark of the Covenant, which carried some of God's presence with them. And as they lived, they had special places where they believed you could go and have an interaction with God. But living on those terms did not satisfy people. It did not. This is like what I say about Eve and Adam. They sent a word up to God and say, we can't live under these conditions. We can't. We're touch and see people. And so they demanded a king. And a king, God's response to that was, but I am your king. I am your king. I am with you. I am your king. I am the sovereign that rules over this land. But there was a reworking. There had to be a reformulation of this theology, a compromise, if you will, in God's understanding that said, okay, if you need a king, you can have a king. And Samuel then anointed Saul, and he was a very disappointing king. And they got rid of him as soon as they brought him on. They wanted a king who would be a warrior, and Saul was not a warrior. He was a man of peace. They weren't happy with that. So there is this push and shove around this idea of a king. We want a king. And the warnings from the prophets were, if you get a king is going to abuse you. He's going to raise taxes to form an army, and then your sons are going to be drafted, and you're going to be miserable. What's wrong with God as the king? And Samuel, the prophet, said, I can interpret God's will for you. Sneeze, and I turn my mic off for a second. It always scares the sneeze away. So it's important for the whole background of the book of Psalms to understand that we're very much into this idea, very deep into the idea that God is now ruling the world. God's reign, God's kingdom, if you will, is now represented by a king on earth. That is a very, very different theology. It's a very different understanding, and I use this word all the time, a reworking of theology. It had to be reworked. And so now they have a king. They have a series of kings. But I think it's fair to say that the witness of the scriptures themselves show it did not go well. It did not go well because, of course, the idea that the king is God's actor on earth is fine, but the king is not God. And the king has problems, makes mistakes. And then people go, well, how does this person represent God to us? This psalm, Psalm 3, started out as a psalm, as it's called in the beginning, a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. And I don't know how familiar you are. Some of you have been reading through with me, and I'll try to remind you that when David was king, his son Absalom led a rebellion against him. Some of David's problems as king, the ones that grew into the worst problems, began with his adulterous affair with Bathsheba, and then his murder of Bathsheba's husband. Here he is, God's representative on earth, and apart totally from his own personal failure and his immoral behavior, the problem is he's supposed to be God's representative on earth. He's supposed to be the one who is guiding the people by listening to God and doing what God tells him to do. This is the contradiction. It creates a horrible tension in the lives of people, and David falls out of popularity. And the one he's least popular with is his own son, Absalom. Absalom leads a revolution to overthrow the king. Unheard of. What, are you resisting God? Are you now throwing off God? Well, I'm sure Absalom would say, no, I'm throwing off a father who refuses to follow God's way, and he needs to be gone. And Absalom pursued David. He had an army, a massive army of support. David, in the story, has a small, trustworthy entourage of very skilled soldiers who are helping to protect him as they move out and move around, fleeing from one town to another. That's very important background, especially because the commentators will tell you that it's very likely that this psalm was actually maybe written in the time of David and reflected originally this struggle of David having to keep his heart and mind set that God was still on his side, even though enemies, familiar enemies, were rising up against him and saying all kinds of things about him. So I'm going to just, having said that much, let's read it, and then I'll do what I've usually done. I'll take you through it as we think about it. And interestingly enough, this psalm quickly moves from an ancient psalm about an ancient time in a specific context and moves to a deep relevance to our own time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So Psalm 3, O Lord, a psalm of David when he fled his son Absalom. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God, Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy hill. I lie down and sleep. I wake again, for the Lord sustained me. I am not afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Rise up, O Lord, deliver me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. and you break the teeth of the wicked. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessing be on all of your people. So, a couple of things I want to say. If you have ever been a reader in worship and you come across this word, Selah, they don't know what this means. If you're looking at your text, you see 3 times in the text it says Selah. It only ever appears in Psalms that have been given a title. A couple of things most people agree on is it's some sort of a musical dynamic indication. Some believe that because these psalms were sung, we've lost long ago the tune, if you will, that they were sung to. In fact, they may have been set to many different tunes, but they were sung. This was a song that kings later, after David, would sing as they were going out into battle. It stirs up notions of the Ark of the Covenant with the language about "Rise up, O Lord." Those are the words that were part when Israelites went out into battle and the Ark of the Covenant was in front of them. They would awaken the presence of God in the Ark and saying, "Rise up, O God, and go out and defeat your enemies." Selah probably was an indication that when you're singing this song, that this is where you should get louder. You should get much louder here. If you sing in a choir, you know there are notes and words, and then there are usually these triangles that indicate dynamics. Most people believe that the Selah is a dynamic to interpret it. It's also possible that in the singing of the song, there were times when you would be down on your knees in a prostrate position, and then there would be times where you should stand up. So in the same way that it's like you should rise up in volume, it may be that here you should rise up, you should stand up, or you should lift up your head. That's the best we can do. I just wanted you to know, when you read Psalms, you do not have to say that word any more than you would say, where you would vocalize anything of the dynamics in a choir piece. The other thing I want to say is that it's really exciting to me. There are 3 parts in the psalm. One is before he sleeps, the other one is after he sleeps, and then the ending, which wraps it up in terms of total confidence in God. Now, in the first part, let's see, I've done the part about the rethinking and the reworking of the text. Now I want to talk to you about this text, this Psalm 3, although it was used primarily and written, we think, to express the things that David may have said or that David may have used in his way of trying to stay focused and not nervous. In his trust of God. So it was related to David, it was written for David, and it's about David's relationship of trying to survive in very difficult situations. But after the time of David, it stayed in practice. People used it, and it was encouraged. Psalm 3, we believe, was used as a psalm to be said when you get up in the morning. You heard that part that David was very worried. His enemies are all around him. He cries out to the Lord, and then he laid down and he went to sleep. This is a morning prayer. This is a reflection about how to change your perspective, and becomes very very contemporary in terms of a possibility for a word to us today, to you and me. So let's see if we can get into it and allow it just to land in our lives. In the first part, it's clear, and for the time it's written, it's clear that King David is facing a military crisis, and he calls out to God for help and also for victory. In particular, the military crisis and the need for victory is in some ways analogous. It's like an analogy to our own lives and the crises that we face. And in a way, you may need in your life a prayer to hope that you're going to win, that God will be with you. Now, here's an important thing. For a king, a victory that a king would have in battle, and this clearly there's language of battle here. Absalom wasn't just pursuing David, he was seeking to kill him. And David's little entourage of soldiers, his posse of defenders, were fully armed and expert military people. There's a military conflict going on, and they sought the death of the king. Absalom sought the death of his father. It's important to know that in this whole idea, this whole theocracy, that if God wants you to win, you'll win. And if God wants you to lose, you're going to lose. So there was this important appeal to God, who had all the winners and losers lined up. God alone gives victory. But the psalmist has heard from his enemies, and this is important because the words of the psalmists, and I refer to the psalmist instead of David. I don't think David wrote this, but this is obviously a psalm written and sung at the time of David. And what David has heard, what the psalmist has heard, is that the enemies of David, Absalom, have said, God has abandoned you. And therefore, we're going to attack you because we know that God has given up on you. God no longer is going to defend you. These are the words that David has heard. This is the part that is sinking deep into his heart on the beginning of the psalm. And you can imagine that David might believe that they might be true. The story of David and Bathsheba makes for good, spicy literature. But the point is, yes, David did see a beautiful young woman in the town and go about, trying to have an affair with her, have an adulterous affair with her, and she got pregnant. But, this is also a story of murder. Because in order to try to make his move legitimate, he found out that Bathsheba's husband was going off to the battlefield, and he had his most trusted generals declare a siege. They went forward, the whole group, and they had the rest of the army all fall back, except for Bathsheba's husband. He was murdered, but he was murdered in a kingly way. It's terrible, and it became known. It was horrible. And Absalom and his group are saying, really? You think you're going to call on God for help at this point? After what you have done? And these words are sailing through the air into David's ears, and he hears them. He's in trouble. But here's something the psalm brings to us. And as I was studying this and realizing, okay, this is really important for me. When you're in conflict and you're being assaulted, or someone's coming after you, or someone is insulting you, you can continue to stare into the eyes of those that are coming at you, and you can keep your ears turned towards receiving everything that they're saying. And the longer that you do that, what happens is the enemy who opposes you is actually growing in your mind. So this is important in terms of, how to survive in battle, right? Is that if you focus only on your opponent, if you focus only on them, what happens is your mind's eye raises them to gigantic proportions. Now, I've never been in battle. I've had contests. I've had conflicts and oppositions. And the little personal advice that is coming here is, and you'll see what happens, that the hypnotic gaze of focusing on your adversary, on the person that you have this opposition with, does you no help. But the psalmist recommends that you turn your eyes toward God. Turn your eyes literally toward God. Stop looking at the problem in front of you and start looking toward God. Turn up, lift up your head. If it does nothing else, it'll stop you from making the problem that's in front of you bigger than it actually is, because that's what we do. When we stay on that plane of the conflict, we make it bigger than it is. So the psalmist says, lift up your eyes toward God, who is a shield around, that is protecting you on all sides. This is the word to the Psalter, to the king, if you will. Lifting up your head signifies a movement from despair to hope. Lift up your head. God not only protects, but God will answer. This goes back now to the psalm. David is realizing that God will deliver him. God knows me. He answers from his holy hill. I cry out to the Lord. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts up my head. Stop looking at the problem in front of you and remember that God is your shield. God is on your side and lifts up your head, and then cry out to the Lord. And in this case, the king says, God will answer me from the holy hill. Now, the holy hill is the top of the mountain where the king was coronated to begin with, and where the promises of God to be with the king were unfolded. So the Psalter is writing the words that encourage us to look away, to stop staring and making larger the problems that are facing us, and look instead to the one who is the source of our hope and our strength in life. It's interesting, too, that when he does that, surrounded by enemies who want to kill him, the psalmist now finds himself invited naturally into an insomnia. But in his looking away from the problem which is in front of him, and his willingness to look toward God who sustains him, he goes to sleep. He goes to sleep. You see, the adversary, the object of the worry and concern, the fear, no longer now is getting bigger because he's looked up, he's looked away, literally lifted up his head away from that problem. And this is why as a person of faith, have loved, this building has this big, pointed ceiling, which has no practical purpose, just makes the building harder to heat. It does make an echoing sound, but I love to go into the big cathedrals and the height of the ceilings, and because as soon as you walk in, what happens? You look up. This is a deep spiritual principle which this psalm lays out for us. So you should know that this psalm became into practice among the Israelites, among the Hebrews, as a morning psalm. This is a psalm to read in the morning. Even though it talks about going to sleep, when you wake from your sleep, turn to this psalm, because what it does is it lays out and says, yes, there are adversaries to face today. There are obstacles and problems and conflicts that will come, but the encouragement is right here, right now. Lift your eyes all the way up until you can think and meditate on and think about God as being with you. He lays down and goes to sleep. The words of trust reflect the morning after. The psalmist had already slept. I lie down, I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. Now listen to the next sentence, chapter 6. I am not afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Where did that confidence come from? It came first from keeping things in perspective, looking up, drawing on the hope that comes from God, and then being able to sleep. Rest. The rest and its implications had banished fear, so that the very multitudes which gave rise to the complaint at the beginning of the psalm now cause no fear. The multitudes had merely talked in enmity, but now they were ready for war, deployed against the psalmist. But the military situation moved toward a climax. The spiritual situation has been transformed into peace by that trust that the psalmist had discovered. This is the peace which passes all understanding. But what's interesting is that in this unfolding of this method, if you will, this method of how to handle the great obstacles or the fears that come to you in your life, the great conflicts that rise, especially when there are people who are saying terrible things about you, and especially if they're true, that victory, human strength alone is not sufficient for life's challenges. And this psalm, by being a morning psalm, by being one that opens us in the beginning of the day to lift our eyes, the psalmist prays that God would smite his enemies on the cheek. Now, don't be too alarmed by the graphicness of this violence. What the psalmist is really praying for is that the words that have been said about the king, the words that have been said about the psalmist, have been brutal words. They're terrible things that have been said. And as I said, they're coming at him. And there's a gross insult that is coming towards the person who is in the center of this psalm. And what he's praying for is when you smite someone on the cheek, you administer an equal gross insult. It's basically a prayer of God to knock them back. Just knock them back a little bit. They've piled insult upon insult on the king. And you know, there's, of course, the First and Second Kings were written by the king's paid ambassadors, but yeah, the truth of David's terrible failures in marriage and in sex and in morality became known because of the prophet, but at least in his mind, he had been forgiven. And the declaration of God was that he had been forgiven. But Absalom and his son and others are refusing to accept that, and they continue to fire torpedoes of words of condemnation towards the king, dragging others with them. I mean, you've lived long enough in your life to know this, right? It can happen in your family, it can happen in your work, it can happen anywhere, this sort of unwinding. And especially in the words of terrible rumors and things that are said about you. Sometimes with a seed of truth in them, you know, but way out of proportion. You see it happen to others. What the psalmist is praying for is, slap them on the cheek and give them a share of their own insult so that they'll back down. Put them back a notch or two. And then this terrible, what seems like a terrible appeal to God, which is to strike the enemies on the cheek and break the teeth of the wicked. The imagery here is that these people who are saying these terrible things are going to have a hard time saying these terrible things when they got a mouthful of broken teeth. It's basically a prayer to silence them, to stop them from doing what they're doing. It has an image of like if savage beasts were attacking you and somehow all of a sudden all their teeth fell out, they would not be as much of a threat, leaving them speechless. The enemies had spoken wicked words. Verse 3 says so. But you, O God, are a shield against me, a shield around me. So he's praying now to silence the enemies. The enemies had spoken wicked words, but mouths cluttered with shattered teeth could no longer utter these kinds of words. So then, let's think a little bit about what this might mean for us. We've already kind of touched on it anyway. This psalm became a devotional, kind of coming out of what was a real military conflict. There's a lot of military language in here. It's clear that shields and battle and war is the background for the writing of this. And in particular, it's probably accurate that it comes out from the time of when David's son was pursuing him to execute him. But there's an important kind of ability and a way in which historically these psalms were read, and that the terminology of battle and war is consistently transformed into spiritual warfare and struggle against evil. That's very important. The particular experience of the kings of Israel and Judah were adapted over time for use in spiritual experiences of all of God's people. Now, I don't mean spiritual in terms of ghosts and goblins. I just mean what we might refer to as emotional. The spiritual being we're not talking about a battle of like sabers and swords and rocks, but we're talking about the battles of our own positioning and the struggle of emotion and position. These are spiritualized things. There was an encouragement, and it's actually believed that Psalm 2 or Psalm 3 and then Psalm 4 were sister psalms in that one should be read in the morning and one should be read in the evening. And that you should read them every day to set your frame of mind right for the living of the day. As a morning prayer, the psalm conveys a particular wisdom. For a person afflicted with troubles or enemies, the opening moments of consciousness which mark a new day can be filled with an awareness of problems on every side. That happens, right? You get up, you don't want to get out of bed. You're aware of everything you have to deal with. But the psalm requires the worshiper a conscious movement of your attention, that you purposefully turn your attention from the things that you have to face today. It's early morning, I've gotten up, and instead of taking an inventory of all the challenges that I face and the things that might worry me about today, instead I turn my eyes toward God and I purposefully change with a conscious movement of my attention. So you move your attention from the troubles to God, who is the source of protection and who answers prayer. After any sleep that you get, there is cause for gratitude and trust. The moments of unconsciousness have ended and life resumes, only because God is the perpetual sustainer. Now, I've thought about this many times in my life. What is sleep? Sleep is the absolute willingness to commit your whole life, everything that's going on that you know about and that you don't know about, completely into a condition of your own vulnerability. Sleep is perhaps the greatest example of your ability to trust. Well, people say to me, I have a hard time trusting. I say, well, do you sleep at night? Because when you go to sleep, you enter into a period of complete unconsciousness, and other people are awake, other things are happening, and you are not part of it. Now, maybe you'll never sleep again. I'm sorry if that's the case. But sleep is a great act of faith. In fact, my grandfather, I'm not proud of this, but he would often be totally bored in church. And he would fall asleep, especially during the sermon. Now, sermons were not exciting and weren't really full of all that much to stay awake for. I know, because even as a young child, I shared his feelings. But he would fall asleep. And when questioned about it, he would say, look, to fall asleep in church is the greatest sign of faith you could ever have. I'm not sure. I don't make that advice today. I preach loud and with a lot of energy to see to it people don't fall asleep. But when you sleep, you must consciously move from the natural state of anxiety through trust and thanksgiving to a prayer for God's victory or salvation and blessing in the day to come. Such a psalm was not only present in the Psalter for instruction, but it was there to be used in the daily spiritual life. So, the words of verse 8 seem at first vindictive and harsh with respect to the enemy. Verse 8, deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessings be on all of your people. Yet in their transformation is not only that one prays for God's actions against the enemy as such, but against the evil which they speak and they do. You made it through the night. Now lift your eyes to God, to God's way in the world, and trust God for the day. And there is, for all the graphicness of, gnash their teeth and whatever, the prayer ultimately is to stop the evil which has taken up the lives of others and turned them against me. This is how it signs off. And deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessing be on your people. May your blessing be on your people. Bring us back to a place of being your people. And this is a prayer, I believe, that can extend even to Absalom and to those who think they're advancing some will of God, but are in David's mind advancing an evil purpose against him and against the purposes of God. So it's powerful in terms of its practicality. If you're facing a difficult time, turn to Psalm 3. And remember everything we've learned about it. And in particular, let me read it again. There are foes on every side, and they are saying to me, you're helpless. There's no help for you in God. But you are my shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I cry out to you, and you answer me from the holy hill, which is a place where you have received the promise of God's protection. And the word Sheila is there. I think it might be exhale. I lie down and I sleep. There's a surrender here. I lie down and I sleep. There should be a long pause right there. And then I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I am not afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around me. Rise up, O God, deliver me, O my God. For you strike all enemies on the cheek, and you break the teeth of the wicked. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessing be on all of your people. Selah. Well, that's it for today, my friends. That's Psalm 3. And I appreciate your coming along with me. And if you want to, go ahead and read ahead to Psalm 4. And maybe you'll pick it up as a regular practice for a while and see how it works. To read Psalm 3 in the morning and Psalm 4 at night. And we'll be back next week to read the second half of this. God bless you in your journeys today. And thanks for tuning in for this time period, for this installment of our journey through the book of Psalms. I'm not sure yet, I don't think we're going to do 150 of these lessons to get all the way through. That's how many Psalms there are, and maybe we'll have some time where we'll deal with them as a group, because there are some that come in groups. And so I encourage you to stay with it. Stay with me, those of you especially who've been reading through. We've gotten quite a ways through in our line-by-line, book-by-book reading through of the Bible and listening to it for all it's worth for life today. God bless you, my friends, and I will see you next week.